Okay, so you send over some pretty intense material on this Jessica Chambers case.
Yeah.
We've got court records, local news articles, even a whole Crime Junkie episode on it.
Wow.
You ready to dive into this one?
Oh, absolutely. It's a really, really fascinating case with a lot of twists and turns.
All right. So to set the scene, December 6th, 2014, in Cortland, Mississippi. It's a tiny town. We're talking like 500 people. Everyone knows everyone.
Right.
And then a burning car is discovered on this, like, deserted road.
And inside is a badly burned young woman, Jessica Chambers, a former cheerleader from the town.
Oh, wow. And even more chilling, the first responders, they actually recognized her right there at the scene.
Yeah.
That really drives home the whole small town setting, you know?
Absolutely.
And the impact this crime had on the community.
Yeah. It's really interesting, too, because even though she could barely speak, Jessica managed to utter a name before she lost consciousness.
Okay.
Either Eric or maybe Derek. It's not completely clear. But this dying declaration, it really becomes the focus of the investigation.
A name whispered from a burning car. It doesn't get much more intense than that.
Yeah.
So let's back up a bit. Tell me about Jessica's last day.
Sure. So she was hanging out with some friends. One of them was a guy named Quinton Tellis. He actually ends up being a key figure in the case later on.
Okay.
Around 5:30 p.m., she gets a call from Quinton, and she drives to a local gas station.
And this gas station is important. Why?
Well, there's surveillance footage of Jessica arriving, and then for a brief moment, she steps out of view of the cameras.
Okay.
She comes back, pays for gas, and drives off. But that footage is really crucial because it shows Jessica interacting with someone we can't see.
Wait a minute. They can see her car. Right. They know it's Jessica's car.
Right.
They can see someone interacting with her, but no one knows who this person is.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, the gas station has other cameras, but none of them cover the area where she went. It's unclear whether this was intentional or just, bad luck.
And did they get any clues from the footage about this mystery person?
Not really. It's too grainy. Can't make out any features, clothing, nothing. It's like this person just vanished.
So we have Jessica leaving the gas station. Then what?
Well, thanks to cell phone data, we know she makes a quick stop in Batesville, a nearby town, and tries to call her friend Keisha a few times. But Keisha's phone was out of minutes.
Oh.
And then around 6:48, she calls her mom, Lisa. And Lisa said something felt off about this call.
What do you mean? What was off?
It was just too quiet. Usually her calls were really noisy, lots of background noise.
Right.
But this one, it was just eerily silent.
Okay, that is kind of unsettling. It does suggest, she might have been somewhere isolated or maybe with someone who didn't want to be heard.
Right. And then about an hour later, her phone pings one last time near the location where her burning car was found. After that, silence. It's likely the phone just overheated and shut down. A little while later, around 8 p.m., someone calls 911 about the burning car.
So tragic. What did investigators find at the scene?
Not a lot, really. A piece of burned clothing, which turned out to be part of a bra, and then pieces of her cell phone. Her car keys actually turned up in a nearby yard later on.
And the autopsy.
Cause of death was thermal injuries and smoke inhalation. The burn pattern showed she'd been doused with some kind of accelerant while sitting in her car, and they later confirmed that it was gasoline.
Oh, that's just awful. I'm guessing the fact that she was found in her underwear immediately raised questions about sexual assault.
Yeah, for sure. That and the whole mystery person at the gas station, it was definitely a red flag. But here's where things get a little strange. No sexual assault kit was performed during the autopsy.
Really? Wow, that seems like a major oversight, especially with all the red flags you've mentioned. Do the records explain why that might be?
Not that I could find. It's just one of the many unanswered questions in this case.
So the investigators had the dying declaration, possibly pointing to an Eric or Derek, and then they also had Quinton Tellis, who had been with her earlier that day.
Yeah.
Where did they focus first?
Well, initially, they really zeroed in on that dying declaration, trying to find an Eric or a Derek. They checked out two guys named Eric who were connected to Jessica on Facebook, but they were quickly ruled out. And then they investigated a registered sex offender named Derek Holmes, who'd had inappropriate contact with Jessica in the past.
Okay, so the two Erics are cleared.
Yeah.
They're looking into this. Derek Holmes. Did he have an alibi?
He did. He said he was at home taking care of his mom. She's diabetic and needed help with her feet that night. His family backed up his story, and his cell phone data seemed to line up too.
So an unusual alibi, but it checked out. Then what?
Well, with those initial leads going nowhere, the case really starts to take on a life of its own in Cortland. Rumors are flying everywhere implicating boyfriends, local gangs, you name it. It even got so bad that the gas station owner's son became the target of these online accusations.
Oh, wow.
People were sending him death threats and stuff, even though he had nothing to do with it.
Yikes. Sounds like the lack of answers really fueled a lot of fear and speculation.
Yeah, absolutely. It just shows you how things can spiral in a small town, especially with a crime like this.
Did any of those theories actually pan out?
Not really. There were some whispers about domestic violence, and then others pointed to Jessica's father, who worked as a mechanic for the county sheriff's department. And some people thought maybe she was a police informant or something, but none of that was ever substantiated.
Okay, so a lot of noise, but no signal. What about Quinton Tellis? Where does he fit into all of this?
Almost a year after Jessica's death, there's a breakthrough,
Well,
and it really puts Quinton in the spotlight. Cell phone data analysis reveals he was actually with Jessica during a time frame he originally denied.
so technology changes the game. What was his response when they confronted him with that?
Well, his story starts to unravel. At first, he denies being with Jessica at all that night. Then, he says they went to Batesville to sell marijuana together. Then, he changes his story again and claims he was at his house that night with a friend named Big Mike.
Okay, so his story is changing, which is never a good sign. Did any of those alibis check out?
Not really. Big Mike actually gave an alibi proving he was in Nashville at the time. And to top it off, Quinton was caught on camera at a dollar store in Batesville around the time of Jessica's murder.
If he was trying to cover his tracks, going to a store with cameras seems like a strange move. What was his explanation for being at the dollar store?
He claimed he was there to buy a cash card for his girlfriend, but by this point, his story is full of holes.
So, shaky alibi, changing story. Was there anything more concrete tying him to the crime?
Well, during questioning, Quinton let slip a very interesting detail. He casually mentioned having sex with Jessica in her car about a week before her death. He even described the specific position of the passenger seat when they did it.
Okay, so he offers up this seemingly random detail. Why is that so incriminating?
Because investigators had already examined Jessica's car, and guess what? The passenger seat was in that exact position that he described.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
a pretty big coincidence. And it's the kind of detail that only someone who had actually been in the car with her would know.
Exactly. So that detail, along with his shifting alibis and the cell phone data putting him in the area, made him the prime suspect. Investigators theorize he might have borrowed his sister's car that night to get a gas can from his shed, which they believe he is seen carrying in that grainy gas station footage.
So they have Quinton on their radar. What was their theory on what happened that night?
They believe that he may have accidentally killed Jessica during a sexual encounter and then, panicking, tried to cover it up by setting her car on fire, not realizing she was still alive. It's a chilling theory, but it led to his indictment for capital murder.
Wow. Talk about a turn of events. But was the evidence strong enough to get a conviction?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated. Despite what seemed like mounting evidence against Quinton, his case was far from straightforward. Quinton's first trial started in October of 2017, and it really brought the whole issue of cell phone data analysis to the forefront.
Yeah, it seems like we hear about cell phone data being used to crack cases all the time now. Did it paint a clear picture of what happened that night?
Well, not exactly. The prosecution really leaned on that data, trying to pinpoint Quinton's location in relation to Jessica's movements. But you gotta remember, this was back in 2014. The technology wasn't as refined as it is now. It was much harder to get those super precise locations, especially since Quinton and Jessica had different cell phone providers.
So even with all this data, there was still room for reasonable doubt.
Oh, absolutely. And the defense really hammered that point home. They argued that the data just wasn't precise enough to put Quinton at the scene when her car was set on fire. They also kept bringing up Jessica's dying declaration, suggesting that she could have very well said Eric, even with her injuries. I mean, remember, she was able to say her own name, Jessica Chambers, pretty clearly.
Yeah, if she could say Jessica Chambers, why not Eric? It does make you wonder, did the jury buy the defense's argument?
Well, it's interesting because the jury actually came back with a not guilty verdict initially. But then, it turned out they'd completely misunderstood the instructions. They thought that if they couldn't all agree on a guilty verdict, then it automatically meant not guilty.
Seriously?
Wow.
That's a pretty big misunderstanding. What happened then?
The judge sent them back to deliberate some more, but they still couldn't reach a unanimous decision, so he declared a mistrial.
Can you imagine being Jessica's family going through all that only to have it end in a mistrial because of a misunderstanding? That's just heartbreaking.
Absolutely. It really shows the human element in these cases and how a tiny misinterpretation can just derail everything. And to make things even more complex, it seems like racial dynamics might have played a role too. Some of the black jurors were worried that the prosecution was going after Quinton just because he was a black man with a record.
It makes you think about how justice isn't always black and white, Our social context, biases, even unconscious ones, can definitely impact how we see the evidence and how decisions are made.
Exactly. This case really highlights that. So we have a mistrial. What happens next?
Well, the prosecution wasn't giving up. They geared up for a second trial in 2018, and they decided to try and simplify things a bit by focusing less on the technical side of the cell phone data. But, just like in the first trial, the defense kept hitting that dying declaration hard, saying she could have said Eric.
So it seems like they were kind of stuck in a loop, rehashing the same arguments. Did the prosecution try anything new to bolster their case?
They did. They brought in a new witness, a woman named Sherry Flowers. She claimed she'd actually given Quinton a ride the night Jessica died, dropping him off near the area where those car keys were found.
So if true, that would explain how he got from the potential crime scene to that dollar store in Batesville where he was caught on camera. Did her testimony make a difference?
It didn't seem to sway the jury as much as they hoped. The defense countered by saying that Quinton had been pressured by the investigators, that his confession wasn't genuine. They also brought up Jessica's possible involvement with drugs, suggesting that someone else might have been responsible for her death.
It's interesting how the defense strategy in both trials seemed to revolve around sowing that seed of doubt, First, it was the ambiguity of the cell phone data and the dying declaration, and then it was the idea of a forced confession and pointing the finger at someone else.
Lots of finger pointing, for sure. So what was the outcome of the second trial?
Another hung jury, unfortunately. This time, they were split right down the middle. 6 for guilty, 6 for not guilty. The judge had no choice but to declare a second mistrial.
2 mistrials. It's hard to imagine the frustration Jessica's family must have felt at this point. It feels like sometimes the system, while trying to be fair, fails to deliver the closure that families so desperately need.
Yeah, it's true. And there's another layer to this story that makes things even more complicated. Remember Quinton Tellis? Well, he was also a suspect in another case, the murder of Ming Chen Mandy Sha.
Hold on, so the guy who's a suspect in the Jessica Chambers case is also a suspect in another murder. Things are getting really tangled now. Who is Mandy Sha? What happened to her?
Mandy was an exchange student from Taiwan who was murdered in her apartment in Louisiana back in July of 2015, about a year after Jessica's death.
And what connects Quinton to Mandy's case? Was it another burning car situation? A dying declaration?
No, nothing like that. This one's different. Surveillance footage actually showed Quinton using Mandy's debit card after she died. He admitted to using the card, but denied any involvement in the actual murder.
Wait, if he had nothing to do with it, how did he get her debit card? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's a head-scratcher. The details around how he got the card are very murky, and he never gave a clear explanation, at least not that I'm aware of.
Well, that's suspicious, to say the least.
Yeah.
You don't just stumble across someone's debit card and think, oh, I'll just use this.
Yeah.
Especially after they've been murdered.
It's definitely a major red flag, and it's one of the reasons he became a suspect in her case.
Okay, so we've got Quinton tied to Mandy Sha's murder through the debit card.
Mm-hmm.
What else did they find out about her case?
Well, there was another key figure in Mandy's case, a guy named Eric Hill. He was the ex-boyfriend of Quinton's sister. Remember how small-town connections keep popping up in this story?
Yeah, it really is. Like, everyone knows everyone in Cortland. You have to wonder if there are any secrets left in a town like that.
Right. Well, this Eric Hill, he gave the investigators a ton of really specific details about Mandy's murder, the kind of details that you'd think only the killer would know.
So Eric Hill is implicating Quinton. Does that wrap things up?
Not quite. Here's where things get even weirder. In 2020, Eric Hill recants his entire testimony. He signs this handwritten affidavit claiming that the police had pressured him into falsely accusing Quinton.
Wait a minute. So first, he gives all this detailed information, and then he says he was forced to lie. That's quite the turnaround. What's the deal here?
It's a real head-scratcher.
Yeah.
And get this, Handwriting analysis of the affidavit showed that it was actually written by both Eric Hill and Quinton Tellis.
Wait, are you serious? So they were both involved in writing the document that was supposed to clear Quinton's name. That's wild. What does that even mean?
Honestly, it just raises more questions about their relationship and their motivations. Did Quinton pressure Eric to recant? Was there some kind of deal? Or was there something else entirely going on?
This is like a whole other mystery on top of the mystery we're already trying to unravel. So what happened with Mandy Sha's case after he recanted? Did they just drop the charges against Quinton?
Well, in 2022, a judge in Louisiana actually dismissed the indictment against Quinton because of a violation of his right to a speedy trial. He was actually about to be released when Mississippi authorities, who were still pursuing those charges in Jessica's case, asked for him to be transferred back to their state to serve out some outstanding sentences he had there.
So he went from potentially walking free to being shipped off to another state to face charges in a completely different case. That's a wild turn of events.
It really is. And as of right now, he's still in custody in Mississippi with a projected release date sometime in 2027.
So we've got two cases, two potential victims, two mistrials, a recanted testimony, and a whole lot of unanswered questions. What do we even do with all this?
That is the question, isn't it? And it's the question that investigators and the families of these victims are still grappling with.
Man, we have been through a lot with these Jessica Chambers and Mandy Sha cases. I mean, it's like a tangled web of connections, conflicting stories, twists and turns everywhere you look. So, let's take a breath here and try to make sense of it all. What are some of the biggest takeaways for you?
You know, the thing that keeps coming back to me is just how much this whole thing hinges on the reliability of what people say. You've got Jessica's dying declaration pointing to an Eric, but with everything going on, it's really hard to know for sure what she was trying to communicate. And then you've got Eric Hill, who first gives this super detailed account about Mandy's murder and then completely takes it back.
And let's not forget that Quinton was apparently involved in writing that affidavit that was supposed to clear his name.
Yeah.
It's just bizarre. It really makes you question everything Eric said, both his initial statements and that recantation.
Yeah, it just shows you how witness testimony, even though it's super important in investigations, can be really shaky ground. Memories can be fuzzy. People can be pressured, coerced, and, personal biases can totally cloud someone's judgment.
Absolutely. And in this case, where you have these small-town dynamics, those personal connections all tangled up, it makes you wonder if those things might have influenced what people said,
It's definitely a possibility. And it makes it that much more important to have other evidence to back up what people say, especially with such serious cases like this.
Well, speaking of evidence, or the lack of it, let's talk about some of the big mysteries that still haven't been solved. Like, we still don't know for sure who that person was that Jessica interacted with at the gas station.
Yeah, that is a huge question mark hanging over this whole story. I know investigators have said they've actually identified the person, but they've never released the name or explained why not. It's a little frustrating, and it feels like a big piece of the puzzle is just missing.
It almost feels like they're holding back information on purpose. Is there anything in the records about why they might be doing that?
No, not really. The reasons are still pretty unclear. It's possible they have their reasons, like maybe to protect the investigation or to keep their options open for a future prosecution.
Well, I guess we have to hope they're doing what they think is best, even if it's frustrating for everyone trying to understand what happened. There's another detail that's always bugged me. That guy who showed up at the fire while the first responders were there. He just appeared out of nowhere and then vanished.
Yeah, that one is definitely strange. What was he doing there? Did he know Jessica? Did he actually see anything useful? It seems like a loose end that never got tied up.
It's crazy to me that in a town as small as Cortland, nobody seems to know who he was or why he was there. You'd think someone would have recognized him.
Right. It's just another example of how this whole case is full of these unanswered questions and strange events that don't really add up.
And we can't forget about that whole debit card situation with Quinton and Mandy Sha. He admits to using it, but never really gives a good explanation for how he even got it.
Yeah, that definitely still raises suspicions about him, regardless of what happened with the trials. Even though the charges in Mandy's case were dropped, that loose end is still hanging out there.
It's like we're left with this feeling of incompleteness, like a whole chapter of the story is missing.
Well, that's often the case with these really complicated cases. You can have years of investigation, multiple trials, tons of people analyzing every detail, and the truth still manages to stay hidden. We may never know for sure what happened to Jessica and Mandy or exactly what Quinton's role was in all of it.
So where does that leave us after all this? What can we say for sure about these cases?
I think it's safe to say that both of these cases are incredibly sad and full of ambiguity. We have a lot of questions that we might never have the answers to. Quinton Tellis is still a person of interest, but as we've seen, the evidence against him isn't clear-cut. We're basically left with a lot of circumstantial stuff, conflicting stories, and lingering doubts.
It just goes to show that sometimes justice is really hard to come by. It can be a long and winding road, and even after all that effort, the whole truth might remain out of reach. But I don't think that means we should give up on trying to find answers or holding people accountable.
I completely agree. And we can't forget about the real people at the heart of this, the families of the victims who have lost their loved ones and are left dealing with the uncertainty and the lack of closure, and their communities who are left to deal with the fear and the after effects of these horrible events.
It's a reminder that these cases aren't just some abstract puzzle to solve. They involve real people whose lives have been forever changed by these tragedies.
And for those of us trying to understand what happened, I think it's important to remember that. We have to be sensitive to the human cost, the pain involved, while also understanding that we might never have all the answers.
That's a really good point. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we're left with, honestly, more questions than answers. But maybe that's okay. Sometimes just exploring these complexities, wrestling with the unknowns, is as important as finding that nice, neat resolution.
I think you're right. And maybe by continuing to ask questions, to dig into the evidence, to keep these cases in the public eye, we might get some new information down the line, something that could help us understand the truth and bring a little bit of peace to the people who have been affected by all of this.
And if there's anyone out there who has any information about either of these cases, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem, please come forward. Even a tiny detail could be the missing piece that helps bring justice.
Absolutely. Sometimes the key to cracking a case is in the hands of someone who doesn't even realize they have it. So if you know something, please say something.
And on that note, we're going to end this deep dive. We're leaving you with the same sense of intrigue and unanswered questions that we're still thinking about ourselves. The Jessica Chambers and Mandy Sha cases are powerful reminders that the truth can be really hard to find. Justice isn't always perfect, and even with all the technology we have today, some mysteries might just stay unsolved. But it doesn't mean we should stop looking for answers, stop trying to understand, or stop hoping for closure. Those things are always worth fighting for, no matter how tough it gets.